Place your final bids. The old man had his chance. That's what the auctioneer shouted as the crowd laughed and raised their paddles. The elderly veteran stood in silence, boots caked in years of honest work, gripping his hat like it was all he had left. But 10 minutes later, a low rumble echoed down the gravel road, and when the black military convoy pulled up and an officer shouted, "Stop the sale by order of the Pentagon," everything changed. If you believe no veteran should lose the land they defended, comment, "Stand for honor" below. Harvey Langston, 82, had worked the same Tennessee soil since 1968, 54 years on the same 2,000 acres of rolling hills and fertile bottomland. Each furrow, fence post, and foundation stone bore witness to his calloused hands and unwavering determination. The farm wasn't just land to Walter, it was the place he'd returned to after 18 months in Korea's frozen hell, the place where he'd carried his bride Joanne across the threshold, where they'd raised 3 children, buried 2 and sent one off to follow his father's footsteps into uniform. It was where Joanne had taken her last breath 4 years ago under the oak tree they'd planted on their wedding day. Walter had been managing fine until the stroke, nothing major. He could still walk, still talk. But the medical bills had piled up like autumn leaves. The new heart medication cost more each month than his father had paid for his first tractor. He'd approached Meridian Bank for a refinance. They'd held his mortgage for 30 years. Surely they'd work with him, but Meridian had been acquired by National Finance Group last spring, and the new loan officer, not much older than Walter's grandson, had barely glanced at his financial history. "Your income-to-debt ratio doesn't meet our current requirements. For Langston, perhaps you should consider selling. This land would make excellent development property." Walter had reached into his wallet, pulled out his Veterans Affairs card. "I served, you know. There are programs for veterans." The young man had smiled thinly. "Those programs require timely applications and extensive documentation. The foreclosure process has already begun. Despite letters from neighbors, appeals to local politicians, and even an inquiry from the American Legion, the foreclosure proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Meridian Bank, or rather National Finance Group, wanted their asset liquidated. On auction day, the early autumn sun cast long shadows across Walter's land. He dressed in his best flannel shirt, pressed his only pair of khakis, and polished the work boots he'd worn for Sunday service since Joanne's passing. His son's flags, both American and Army, hung limply from the crooked pole beside the barn that needed repairs he could no longer afford. The auctioneer, a loud man with an expensive watch and cheap cologne, stood on a hastily erected platform near Walter's driveway. 40 or 50 people milled about, developers in pressed shirts, farmers eyeing his John Deere with calculating stazes, and curiosity seekers drawn by the spectacle of an old man's downfall. "Folks, we've got a prime property here," the auctioneer announced, microphone screeching with feedback. 200 acres farmhouse needs work, but the land's what you're paying for. Bank ordered sale, all bids final. Walter stood at the edge of the crowd, fingers working the brim of his hat. He'd fought in war, buried a wife and 2 children, weathered droughts and floods and everything in between. But this watching strangers appraise his life's work, like vultures circling this, cut deeper than any physical wound. Old man had his chance, the auctioneer continued, voice dropping confidentially as if sharing a secret, though the microphone carried his words clearly. "Couldn't keep up with the times, his loss. Your gain, folks." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the crowd. Most avoided looking at Walter directly, but a tall man in an expensive suit, developer, judging by the 3 younger men flanking him with tablets and folders, openly smirked. "Starting bid is $450,000. Do I hear $450,000? Walter closed his eyes. The farm had been appraised at over $800,000 2 years ago, and his demand values had skyrocketed post-pandemic. The bank wasn't just taking his home, they were stealing it. No one stood with him. Not the sheriff who'd served the eviction papers with mumbled apologies. Not Judge Temple who'd approved the sale without a hearing. Not even Pastor Mike who'd promised to come but was conspicuously absent. Walter simply watched, silent dignity, his only shield as the paddles began to rise. The bidding moved rapidly as the auctioneer's practice chant accelerated. $450,000 quickly became $500,000, then $550,000. Walter's century-old barn, the fields where his children had played, the pond where he taught his grandson to fish, all reduced to dollar figures and lot numbers. $57,000 from the gentleman in the blue suit. Do I hear $600,000? The tall developer, Wilson Properties, according to the logo on his associates' polo shirts, raised his paddle again without hesitation. $600,000. The $1,000. This is prime development land, folks. Imagine a golf course where that old barn stands. Luxury condos with views of the valley. Don't miss out. Walter's hand tightened around the brim of his hat. Knuckles White Golf Course. They would tear down the barn his grandfather had built, fill in the pond where generations of Langston children had learned to swim, level the gentle hills where Joanne's oaks still stood sentinel. Who cares? A teenager whispered loudly to his father, boredom evident in his voice. He's just some old man, not like he'll live much longer anyway. The father didn't correct him, just shrugged. The crowd laughed when the auctioneer gestured toward Walter's farmhouse with his peeling paint and sagging porch. Maybe we should throw in the chicken coop as a bonus. Old-timer might need somewhere to sleep tonight. Walter said nothing, face impassive. He took a pocket where he kept Joanne's photograph alongside a yellowed, carefully folded letter. The letter had arrived 50 years ago after he'd hosted a military training exercise on his land during the Cold War's darkest days. Signed by General Thomas Holloway himself, it promised that in recognition of your patriotic contribution to national readiness and your distinguished service, this land shall not be taken from a man who wore the uniform of this nation with honor. Empty words it seemed, just like thank you for your service, and we'll never forget. 67 and 5,000 the auctioneer called out going once. The developer raised his paddle again. $700,000. $700,000. Going once, going twice. From somewhere distant came the low, unmistakable rumble of heavy engines. Walter recognized the sound immediately, the distinctive growl of military transport vehicles moving at speed, a sound he hadn't heard in decades yet, one that lived in his bones. The crowd turned as the rumble grew louder. Dust rose beyond the property line. It is 4 black SUVs with government plates, followed by 2 larger transport vehicles roared up the gravel road. They formed a precise semicircle around the auction site, engines cutting simultaneously. The doors opened and uniformed personnel emerged, not local police or state troopers, but active-duty military, their bearing unmistakable. A silver-haired colonel strode directly toward the auction platform, flanked by 2 officers carrying document cases. His uniform bore the insignia of the Judge Advocate General's Corps military lawyers. The colonel mounted the steps to the platform in 2 efficient strides. The auctioneer backed away, microphone dangling forgotten from his hand. This auction is suspended effective immediately, the colonel announced, voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. By order of the Department of Defense Pentagon Authorization Code, November Echo 739, the sheriff stepped forward, hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. Now hold on just a minute. This is a legal county proceeding. You can't just... The colonel turned to face him, expression neutral yet somehow conveying absolute authority. Sheriff Connolly, I believe you'll find our jurisdiction supersedes yours in this matter. He nodded to one of his officers who presented a leather portfolio with special seals clearly visible. As the sheriff reluctantly examined the documents, a young lieutenant detached from the group and approached Walter. Her uniform was impeccable, her posture perfect as she rendered a crisp salute. Sergeant Langston, Lieutenant Grayson, Sir General, Holloway was my grandfather. Walter's eyes widened slightly in recognition. He made us promise, she continued, voice low enough that only Walter could hear. Before he died last month, he made us promise to check the registry to make sure the letter was honored. She glanced at his pocket where the edge of the yellowed paper was visible. You trained my father at Fort Ridgeway in '85. He never forgot what you taught him about duty. Neither did we. Behind them, the developers' protests grew louder, joined by the auctioneer's sputtering objections. This is outrageous. I have investors waiting. We have rights. The colonel's voice cut through the commotion like a blade. So does Sergeant Langston, rights he earned in blood while others slept safely in their beds. Rights we intend to enforce now. Judge Temple's black Mercedes skidded to a stop behind the military vehicles 20 minutes later. He emerged, red-faced, judicial robes hastily thrown over his golf attire, the country club logo still visible on his polo collar. What is the meaning of this interruption? He demanded, striding toward the colonel. I authorized this sale personally. The bank has every right with respect to your honor, the colonel interjected. You authorized it without complete information. He gestured to one of his officers who presented a second portfolio. These documents were filed with the Department of Defense in the Veterans Land Registry in 1973. They constitute a binding federal easement on this property. Walter stood straighter now, the weight that had pressed down on his shoulders visibly lifting. Lieutenant Grayson remained at his side, her presence both protective and respectful. Judge Temple scanned the documents, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion to concern. This appears to be a military land use agreement, but surely it's expired. It has not. the colonel stated firmly. The agreement designates this farm as an emergency reserve asset under the Rural Strategic Resources Act. It cannot be sold through foreclosure unless the owner voluntarily surrenders title or is deceased. Neither condition has been met. He produced another document. Furthermore, Sergeant Langston qualifies under the Veterans Protection Act Amendment of 2021 for mortgage assistance and medical debt relief. His application was misplaced by National Finance Group 6 times. Murmurs spread through the crowd as camera phones captured the unfolding scene. The local newspaper reporter who had come expecting a routine foreclosure story was now frantically taking notes. The bank representative pushed forward. "This is preposterous. We followed all legal procedures. Did you buy a hero?" The colonel's voice remained measured but carried an edge of steel. "Our investigation suggests otherwise. Failure to process a qualified veterans assistance application, failure to check the federal easement registry, accelerated foreclosure proceedings in violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act." He paused. "The federal justice has taken an interest in your bank's pattern of similar buy-ins across 3 states. The colonel turned to address the assembled crowd. "This man," he said, gesturing to Walter, "carried wounded soldiers through frozen rice paddies while mortar fire rained down. He earned the Bronze Star with valor. When he returned home, he opened this farm to military exercises during the height of the Cold War, allowing training that helped secure this nation when nuclear war seemed imminent. I was only a veteran a few days ago." "What does that have to do with—" "It has everything to do with today," Lieutenant Grayson interrupted, stepping forward, "because a promise made to a veteran doesn't expire with changing bank ownership or real estate values." From one of the transport vehicles, soldiers were unloading crates. The first contained Walter's military records and medals, including those he had returned to the government years ago. The second crate held documents, a new deed transferring the land back to Walter's ownership, mortgage documents showing the loan restructured under Veteran Assistance Program, and medical bill statements marked "satisfied and full" under the Veterans Health Benefit Emergency Act. "The United States government acknowledges its debt to Sergeant Harvey Langston," the colonel announced formally. "His property is hereby protected under federal easement, his mortgage restructured, and his medical obligations recognized as service-connected." He turned to the auctioneer, the bank representative, and the developer. "This auction is not merely postponed. It is cancelled permanently." Judge Temple, now fully aware of the legal and public relations disaster unfolding before him, cleared his throat. "In light of this new information, I am officially rescinding the foreclosure authorization. The court apologizes for the oversight." The sheriff, who had been nervously reviewing the federal documents, nodded quickly. "We'll ensure Mr. Langston is not disturbed further." Walter stood in the center of it all, still clutching his hat, still glistening but spine straight. He didn't speak. Couldn't speak through the emotion tightening his throat. Around him, the same neighbors who had watched in silence now looked away in shame as the military personnel secured the property and the disappointed bidders dispersed. Lieutenant Grayson gently took Walter's arm. "Let's go home, Sergeant. You're home. If you believe land built on sacrifice should never be sold for profit, share this with someone who still believes in honor." Walter didn't give interviews to the reporters who gathered at his gate that evening. He simply stood on his porch watching as the sun set over fields that would remain his until he took his final breath. The military personnel didn't leave immediately. Young soldiers in work uniforms emerged from the transport vehicles with tools and supplies. Some began repairing the broken fence along the eastern property line. Others started scraping and painting the weather-beaten barn. A carpenter examined the sagging porch steps and immediately set to work replacing rotted boards. As darkness fell, floodlights illuminated the work. Walter offered his help, but Lieutenant Grayson gently insisted he rest. "Let us do this," she said, "not because you can't, but because we should." At dawn, the lieutenant and the colonel joined Walter at the flagpole by the barn. The old tattered flag had been replaced with a new one, its stars bright against the morning sky. Together, they raised it, the young officers in perfect uniform, the old soldier in his work clothes, while the assembled troops stood at attention. No speeches were made. None were needed. Before they departed, the colonel presented Walter with a simple plaque to mount beside his driveway. It read, "This land protected by the United States military in honor of Sergeant Harvey Langston, who protected the United States when called Semper Fidelis." Walter declined all interview requests in the days that followed, but he did pen a short note that he posted to his newly repaired gate. "This land was never mine. I just kept it ready in case America ever needed it again." The story spread rapidly across veteran networks, then mainstream media. "Pentagon stops auction, veterans' land saved," ran headlines nationwide. Congressional inquiries into predatory lending practices.
targeting veterans were announced within a week. The mayor, sensing the shifting winds, declared Walters' property a historical site. National Finance Group, facing federal investigation and public backlash, announced a comprehensive review of all veteran mortgages in their portfolio. 1 month after the auction that never completed, a convoy of young cadets from the nearby military academy arrived at Walters' farm. They came not for photo opportunities or publicity, but to listen, to learn what words like duty, sacrifice, and honor meant when lived rather than merely spoken. As twilight painted the Tennessee hills in fading gold, Walter sat on his repaired porch watching the young cadets depart. He was not a man who had been saved by others, but a man who had finally been seen for who he truly was, a guardian of more than just land. Subscribe to Steelheart Stories. If you believe real honor doesn't wear out, it only grows deeper with time.